The buildings didn't crack, they didn't lean, they didn't give any warning at all. One moment they were standing, the next each floor was pressing flat against the one below it, concrete slab on concrete slab, all the way to the ground, in the time it takes to exhale. Engineers have a name for this, they call it a pancake collapse. And in the 39 seconds between the first earthquake and the second on June 24, 2026, it happened across dozens of buildings in La Guaira, Carabaleta, Macuto, and Caracas simultaneously. 2,595 people are confirmed dead. 862 aftershocks have rattled the rubble since. And the structural engineers who reviewed the footage in the days that followed said something that should be impossible to ignore. This didn't have to happen this way. That statement is not an accusation against Venezuela. It is a diagnosis. And the diagnosis applies to cities far beyond Caracas. It applies to Memphis. It applies to Portland. It applies to Seattle. It applies to any American city built on soft soil, with old concrete buildings, above a fault line that hasn't moved yet, which, as it turns out, includes most of them. Venezuela just handed America the most detailed blueprint for urban earthquake catastrophe it has ever received. The question is whether anyone will read it. To understand why Caracas collapsed the way it did, you need to understand what a pancake collapse actually is, not as a metaphor, but as a structural engineering failure mode with a specific cause, a specific trigger, and a specific body count. In a well-engineered concrete building, the vertical columns that hold each floor in place are designed to bend before they break. They absorb energy, they deform, they give occupants seconds, sometimes minutes, to escape. Engineers call this property ductility. It is not an accident of good construction. It is a design choice, achieved by wrapping the vertical steel reinforcing bars inside each column with closely spaced horizontal steel ties or hoops. Those ties hold the reinforcing bars in position as the concrete around them cracks under seismic stress. The column bends. It does not shatter. In a non-ductile concrete building, the kind that makes up a substantial portion of the built environment in Caracas and a terrifying proportion of the built environment in American cities built before 1980, those ties are absent, or spaced so widely they provide almost no confinement. When the seismic wave arrives, the concrete around the reinforcing bars shatters outward. The core loses its strength. The column gives way in seconds, and the floor above it, with no support remaining, drops straight down onto the floor below, which then drops onto the floor below that. Floor by floor, in a fraction of a second, the building collapses to ground level with almost no survivable void space remaining inside. This is why pancake collapse buildings are so lethal for survivors and so dangerous for rescue teams. There is almost nowhere inside to have survived, and the compacted concrete makes extraction agonizingly slow, which is why it took 120 hours to reach one man trapped beneath a collapsed shopping mall in Catia Lamar, and why a father of two emerged from the rubble on July 2nd to the sound of applause from an entire rescue operation that had worked for 5 consecutive days to reach him. David Koch, a structural engineer in California and former president of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, reviewed the footage and identified the same failure mode across multiple collapsed structures in La Guaira. Soft soils, tall towers, older concrete, the three variables that, when combined, transform a powerful earthquake into a mass casualty event. The buildings, he said, simply did not have the modern reinforcing steel connections that would have allowed them to absorb the doublet's energy rather than shatter under it. Venezuela's first seismic building standard, Covenant 1756, was not approved until 1982. Every concrete structure built before that year was designed without the column confinement requirements that became mandatory after it. The code was updated in 1998 and again in 2019, tightening standards each time. But building codes only govern new construction. They do not reach backward in time to retrofit the buildings already standing. And in Venezuela, the gap between what the code requires and what was actually built is staggering. Elena Oliver Saiz, an architect and structural engineering expert, estimated that less than 25% of Venezuela's constructions comply with seismic standards. 3 out of every 4 buildings in the country were built to standards that engineers already knew were insufficient, or built with no standards at all. Stop for a moment. Less than 25%. In a country that sits on one of the most active strike-slip plate boundaries in the Western Hemisphere, that has experienced devastating earthquakes in 1812, 1900, 1967, and now 2026, less than 1 in 4 buildings was built to withstand the thing that every seismologist in the country knew was eventually coming. Now here's the part of this story that American audiences need to sit with. Because the structural vulnerability that killed thousands of people in Caracas on June 24th is not unique to Venezuela. It is not a product of poverty alone, or of political dysfunction alone, or of any condition exclusive to South America. It is a product of age. And America's cities are old. The United States contains an estimated 1.5 million non-ductile concrete buildings constructed before 1980, the same failure mode that drove the Pancake collapses in Caracas. These are not abandoned structures. They are occupied apartment buildings, office towers, hospitals, schools, and parking garages in every major American city that was built before modern seismic engineering became standard practice. In Los Angeles alone, the city identified more than 13,500 concrete buildings requiring mandatory seismic retrofitting. As of 2026, thousands remain unreinforced. In San Francisco, an estimated 4,800 wood-frame soft-story buildings, structures whose ground floors are open garages or commercial spaces with minimal shear walls, remain at high risk of pancake collapse in a major earthquake. But the cities that most directly mirror Caracas' situation are not on the West Coast. They are in the central and eastern United States, where building codes were not updated for seismic risk until far later, where earthquake preparedness has historically received a fraction of the attention it gets in California, and where the underlying geology creates amplification conditions nearly identical to the sedimentary basin beneath Caracas. Memphis, Tennessee, a city of 630,000 people, sitting directly above the New Madrid seismic zone, built largely on Mississippi River sediment that will liquefy under strong seismic shaking exactly as the soil beneath Carabaleta liquefied on June 24th. FEMA's earthquake scenario modeling for Memphis projects 86,000 casualties and $296 billion in damage from a major New Madrid event. The majority of Memphis's older building stock, unreinforced brick structures built before any seismic code existed in Tennessee, will perform in a major earthquake the way Venezuela's pre-1982 concrete performed on June 24th. The physics are identical, only the geology and the name of the city are different. Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington. Both cities sit near the Cascadia subduction zone, which last fully ruptured in 1700 and is now 326 years into a recurrence interval estimated between 200 and 500 years. Both contain thousands of unreinforced masonry buildings, old brick structures with no internal steel reinforcement that FEMA and state emergency managers have identified as the single largest source of seismic risk in the Pacific Northwest. Oregon's Department of Geology estimates a Cascadia megathrust earthquake would collapse or severely damage most of Portland's unreinforced masonry buildings within minutes. Eduardo Miranda, a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University, noted that soft stories are a problem everywhere in the world. In Venezuela, they are particularly prevalent. But prevalent is relative. San Francisco's 4,800 soft-story buildings. Los Angeles's 13,500 non-ductile concrete structures. Portland's thousands of unreinforced masonry buildings. The inventory is enormous. The retrofitting timeline in most cities spans decades. This is the blueprint Venezuela just handed America. Not a hypothetical, not a model. A real event on real soil in a real city with a real death toll still being counted. The variables that produce catastrophe in Caracas, soft sedimentary soil amplifying seismic waves, non-ductile concrete with no capacity to absorb energy, a doublet delivering 2 destructive wave trains before the first had finished, are not exotic. They are replicable. They exist, to varying degrees, in dozens of American cities. What Venezuela did not have was time. The warning existed. The seismic history was known. The building vulnerability was documented. Less than 25% compliance was not a secret. Engineers had cited it for years before June 24th. The fault had last moved in 1812. The recurrence math was not hidden. What was missing was not knowledge. It was action taken before the knowledge became irrelevant. The man pulled from the rubble after 120 hours survived because a void happened to exist in the specific pile of concrete surrounding him. In a pancake collapse, the margin between survival and death is measured in cubic feet of empty space. Whether that space exists depends entirely on how a building was built, decades before the earthquake arrives. America has the building inventory. It has the seismic hazard data. It has the FEMA models. It has now 2,595 reasons why the gap between knowing and acting is not abstract. The question is whether the blueprint gets read before the next city needs one. Subscribe to Seismic Alert. We will keep watching.